Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. The various scenarios that Moses presents in Deuteronomy are almost comical in nature. His seemingly endless list of strange situations and the particular laws that apply to them is truly amazing. But it just goes to show how deeply God cares about the holiness of His people. He leaves nothing to chance. And in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 11 through 19, Moses deals with three seemingly dissimilar and disconnected scenarios that appear to have little in common. But in reality, they all deal with personal holiness, as exhibited in the day-to-day interactions between the people of God. Their status as God's chosen people was intended to make a difference in the way they lived their lives. Interpersonal relationships are so important in God's family. The proper care and concern for each other's well-being was mandatory, and all those who treated Israelites poorly were to be dealt with severely. When men fight with one another, and the wife of the one draws near to rescue her husband from the hand of him who is beating him, and puts out her hand and seizes him by the private parts, then you shall cut off her hand. Your eye shall have no pity. You shall not have in your bag two kinds of weights, a large and a small. You shall not have in your house two kinds of measures, a large and a small. A full and fair weight you shall have. A full and fair measure you shall have, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. For all who do such things, all who act dishonestly, are an abomination to the Lord your God. Remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt, how he attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary, and cut off your tail, those who were lagging behind you, and he did not fear God. Therefore, when the Lord your God has given you rest from all your enemies around you, in the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 11 through 19. As has been the case throughout this section of Deuteronomy, verses 11 through 19 of chapter 25 contain additional regulations that appear to have no rhyme or reason to them. Not only do they seem to lack any common thread of logic, at least one of them deals with what would appear to be a highly unlikely scenario and a heavy-handed form of punishment. Excuse the pun. Moses brings up the case of a dispute between two men. In Hebrew, the phrase describes a man and his brother. So it's unclear as to whether this involves two sons of the same mother or two Israelites. But in either case, the scenario Moses paints involves a conflict between two men that has resulted in the throwing of punches. In other words, the dispute has gone from verbal to physical. Now, this would not have been a rare occurrence in Israel. Men will be men, and anger has a way of getting out of hand. But Moses introduces another actor to the drama, whose actions complicate the scene and require the divine regulation that follows. The point of the passage is not the bare-knuckles brawl between the two men, but the indelicate behavior of one of their wives. Moses describes her involvement this way. The wife of the one draws near to rescue her husband from the hand of him who is beating him, and puts out her hand and seizes him by the private parts. Deuteronomy 25, verse 11. Now, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to figure out what's going on here, and many of the modern translations of the Scriptures provide much more specific wording to get the point across, such as genitals, sex organs, or testicles. Suffice it to say, the woman's efforts to aid her husband involve what would have to be considered as immodest and indecent behavior. While we might want to say that the heat of the moment provides ample justification for her actions, Moses obviously disagrees. He provides no excuse for the woman's behavior, demanding instead that her hand be cut off as punishment for her actions. It would appear that the fight involves a non-life-threatening confrontation. One man is beating up another. There are no swords drawn, death is not imminent or even intended, but the woman, attempting to come to the aid of her husband, commits an act of indecency that could actually result in permanent physical harm to her husband's adversary. By grabbing the man's genitals, she would likely incapacitate him, giving her husband the upper hand in the fight, but she also risked doing irreparable damage to the man's reproductive capacities. And this seems to be the point of the passage, and the reason behind the severe punishment demanded by God. Her response would not only be considered indecent and improper, but it would also be deemed an excessive force of retribution. It's interesting to consider the lex talionis, or laws concerning retaliation. They're found throughout the Pentateuch. If there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Exodus 21, verses 23 through 25. If anyone injures his neighbor, as he has done, it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Whatever injury he has given a person shall be given to him. Leviticus 24, 19 through 20. Your eye shall not pity. It shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 21. It would appear that Moses is citing a case where the woman's actions did not result in permanent damage to the man's genitals. If it had, according to the lex talionis, or the law of retribution, her husband would have to suffer a similar fate. But since the wife was the one guilty of committing the crime, she would be the one to suffer the punishment. And in this case, God prescribes the punishment as the cutting off of her hand. There is no tit-for-tat retribution involved, which seems to suggest that her actions had no long-term or permanent impact. But she would suffer the consequences of her actions nonetheless. She had intended to do harm, and her actions could have had serious repercussions that left a man incapable of having children. This was a serious crime in God's eyes, and it came with serious consequences. And as he seems prone to do, Moses suddenly shifts his attention to less dramatic matters, focusing on dishonesty. He mentions the use of different measures. This is a reference to the scales used in buying and selling. Since Israel was predominantly an agrarian society, when produce was sold, it was placed on one side of the scale, and the form of payment was placed on the other. A bag of wheat equaled a certain amount of coin. So if you had two different forms of measurement, it essentially meant you had false scales and an intent to cheat the one with whom you were conducting business. The prophet Micah records the words of God concerning those who would do such a thing. Shall I acquit the man with wicked scales and with a bag of deceitful weights? Micah 6, verse 8. And the book of Proverbs provides further insight into God's perspective on dishonesty in business. The Lord detests the use of dishonest scales, but he delights in accurate weights. Proverbs 11, verse 1. And God had provided the Israelites with his laws concerning this matter. Do not use dishonest standards when measuring length, weight, or volume. Your scales and weights must be accurate. Your containers for measuring dry materials or liquids must be accurate. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Leviticus 19, verses 35 through 36. Accuracy and honesty are important to God. He is a just and righteous God who expects his people to treat one another with love and respect. To cheat someone is nothing less than an outward display of hatred for them. It's to rob them of what they are rightfully due. And in cheating someone, you're setting yourself up as God, establishing your own standards and signifying your will as greater than God's. But Moses makes it painfully clear that all who do such things, all who act dishonestly, are an abomination to the Lord your God. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 16. Finally, Moses brings up God's commands concerning Israel's relationship with the Amalekites. In the book of Exodus, there's the story describing Israel's first encounter with these people. They appeared on the scene at a place called Rephidim, where they launched an unprovoked attack on the Israelites. While Joshua did battle with the Amalekites, Moses stood on a nearby hill, holding up the staff of God as a symbol of God's presence and power. As long as he held the staff aloft, the Israelites prevailed. But as the battle raged on, his arms grew weary, and Aaron and Hur were required to assist him in keeping the staff held high. Eventually, the forces of Israel prevailed, and God made a pronouncement concerning the Amalekites. Write this as a memorial in a book and recite it in the ears of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar and called the name of it, The Lord is my banner, saying, A hand upon the throne of the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Exodus 17, verses 14 through 16. Now Moses is reminding the Israelites that they were to fulfill God's will concerning the Amalekites. There were to be no compromises or concessions made. God had decreed that the Amalekites were to be blotted out, and he fully expected his people to carry out his wishes. Hundreds of years later, when Saul had been appointed the first king of Israel, God reiterated his will that the Amalekites be wiped out. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I have noted what Amalek did to Israel in opposing them on the way when they came up out of Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek, and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. 1 Samuel 15, verses 2 through 3. But Saul failed to obey God's command. 1 Samuel records, But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen and of the fattened calves and the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless they devoted to destruction. 1 Samuel 15, verse 9. And as a result of Saul's disobedience, God rejected him as king. This man had chosen to partially obey, making compromises and concessions that were unacceptable to God. And Samuel, the prophet of God, delivered the following indictment against Saul. Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and presumption is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. 1 Samuel 15, verses 22 through 23. Saul had chosen to act perversely. According to dictionary.com, someone who acts perversely is willfully determined or disposed to go counter to what is expected or desired. He did not do what God had told him to do. But God considers obedience far better than sacrifice. As Jesus told his disciples, If you love me, you will keep my commandments. John 14, verse 15. All of these issues were important to God. There was no place among his chosen people for acts of immodesty, dishonesty, or perversity. He expected obedience. He demanded holiness. And he left nothing to the imagination when describing what holiness was to look like in real life.